Welcome to another Tech Stuff Tuesday. First, I'd like to thank one of our Patreon contributors, Kendall Holly. He's been a strong contributor to us. If you would like to be a Patreon contributor, you can do that in the link below. This week, we've got a Crunch Fatboy 12. It is torn down. I blew it up in a prior video. I'll link that below. And we're going to rebuild it. This sub is about 20 years old. So we're going to use a little bit updated methods or updated parts on this. And what it used to look like is this. So we had a pretty large surround. This has a 2-inch coil. You can see this is as far as it will move. There's no need for this surround, and in modern day parts we can't actually get a 2-inch coil cone with this surround on it. So we're going to be changing that up a little bit. It's going to look a little bit different. We do have the original dust cap. This will be used, so it'll keep a little bit of the authenticity. We have a spider that's a dual voice coil. This is a single voice coil sub, so we're going to make this a single voice coil spider. And we're using a dual voice coil. We're also going to make this a single voice coil. The cone we'll be using looks a little bit different, but it will perform pretty well. So in the end, this will look a little bit different, but it will be back to a new state and a better state than it originally was. This was rated for 250 watts RMS. This will take a little bit more power now, maybe 350, 400 watts, the enclosure depending. But I'm going to go through the step-by-step process on rebuilding a 20-year-old Crunch Fatboy 12. So let's get started. The first step here is going to be cleaning the basket. We've got to take the gasket off. We'll have to replace it with a modern gasket, unless I can find these somewhere, but I'm guessing not. We'll just put a rubber gasket on it. They work much better anyway. So we got to get the basket cleaned up. That also means cleaning the old spider off the basket. So I'll show you how we do that, and then we'll start the build. So here we've got the sub on the floor on foam so we don't scratch the motor. Now what we're going to use to clear this off is a grinder with a flapping wheel. Now this one is like a 40 grit, I think, or 60 grit, something like that. You can use a low grit like that. It does take off material very quickly. If you use a higher one like 120 or something like that, it'll go slower. Now the reason you want to use this versus a grinding wheel is the flapping wheel will not gouge the metal. It will clear off the material, but it will scrape the metal, not remove or gouge the metal. So I want to use these discs. It's a very, very quick method of doing it. I do recommend wearing gloves. This material can get very hot from the friction, so you don't want to burn your hand. I also recommend using a respirator like this, because when you are grinding this off, there are adhesives that can come off of there and emit an odor that can be toxic. So I do recommend wearing these, as well as eye protection and the gloves. That is the safest way to go about doing this, so you don't get burnt, get anything in your eye, or inhale anything that you shouldn't inhale. Some of this stuff can generate a lot of smoke as well, so a well-ventilated area is also good. I'm in my warehouse, so I've got 10,000 square feet of air to fill. If you're in your garage, it can get smoky pretty fast. I'd open a door. Now, something I forgot to mention earlier, you got to make sure that you tape off the gap so you don't get any material down in there. It can be very, very difficult to remove, especially if you're using a steel basket. Steel baskets do produce sparks. That is a ferrous metal. It will get stuck down in the gap. You can tell all of this is stuck to the tape. So you've got to make sure this is cleared off. you're not in an area that can catch fire from sparks. If you're using a steel basket, aluminum will not spark. And now we've got this cleaned up, we can actually start the build. I mentioned before that this is a dual voice coil spider, and this is going to be a single voice coil sub. So the way that we're going to make this happen is we're going to cut off these leads. They're sewn down to the spider, not run through the spider. So you've got to carefully cut off all these points that it's secured to pull these two leads off. So I spent a few minutes carefully getting everything loose, everything that's tying it down. There's a little bit of glue where they glue those down, so I can't really do a lot about that. I don't want to damage the spider trying. So now we have a single voice coil spider, and we can get on to the rest of the build. So this is our coil. I've already test fit to make sure that it goes in the gap. I measured it prior, so I knew what coil to use. This is a 2-inch copper coil. That is what came out of it, but this one has a slightly larger outside diameter and slightly longer. So I actually have a little bit more X-Max out of this one the spider's providing, which I think will work out just fine. These spiders actually have a little bit larger roll than the factory one did, so this will have a little bit more excursion to it. For lining this up, we have an 8mm top plate. And you can't see it. This mark was already on there, but I made a gold mark that you can't really see very well. So I've got it to where this one, I know where it will line up on the top plate. The issue being you can't see the top plate because there's no basket vents. Everything else that we build, there's always a vent down here. So what we're gonna have to do is set the spider on this, get it kind of lined up, and then just kind of peek through the bottom here. Kind of estimate right where we get it very, very close to the top plate, and then we'll have our proper alignment. And of course, we do have to shim this, and we can do that with the same method we always use, which is printer paper. So we've got the coil in the spider, and I found out that this is one sheet of paper. That's the shim. One sheet of paper. It is that tight. It's the only coil I could find that would even fit, so it's going to be very tight. The gap is not particularly large, so it'll be very, very tight on the pole side, as well on the outside. And something also worth noting, I checked on here, and the Gauss reading is over 6,700. So this tiny motor with the 2-inch coil, 6,700 Gauss. That goes to show that the Gauss reading is not necessarily how strong it is as a performer. Like if you're looking at SPL subs, that kind of thing, we're saying, well, it has higher Gauss. It's 6,000, it's 7,000. This also has almost 7,000, a little over 6,700. I did an article on that several years ago on our website, and it's kind of showing that, but just a fun fact here, Crunch Fat Boy from 20 years ago, 6,700 Gauss. Now we've got our shim in place. We can slide the coil and spider on top here and get our proper alignment. I'm setting this down extra far on here so we can have the coil get pushed down and make sure that the spider stays perfectly straight. We don't want to crook anything like that. So if we let the basket push the spider up, that'll make sure everything is perfectly straight. Okay, so now that we've got this in place, I bring up the coil. So this is a dual voice coil, and we have a positive and negative, and a positive and negative. And you notice I've put the leads right here on this side. And the reason being, the positive and negative here are going to get connected to the coil. We're taking this dual voice coil and making it a single we're wiring the coil in series under the dust cap. So we've got the positive and negative of the other coil. All this is going to be done under the dust cap above the cone while these get moved over here. I'll get just a little bit of glue down in here to hold this in place. Now that we've got this all assembled, we have to put on the cone. And one thing we're going to observe here is we want to have our leads lined up with our terminals here. We've got that done. And then we've got notches in the surround here. So we're going to make sure that these line up with the basket. So we'll get the cone on here. Now with the cone in place, we've got to solder the leads from the coil to the tinsel leads on the spider. And as I mentioned before, this is a dual voice coil that's getting turned into a single voice coil. So on each side we have a positive and negative lead. And we have to make this go in series under the dust cap here. So you'll never know that this was a dual voice coil as a single voice coil sub. So to do that, we'll just tie our positive and negative together here, which I'll get that tied up and soldered. And then on this end, we have to note that this is a positive and this is a negative, but on the tinsel leads, this side is positive and this side is negative. So we'll have to cross over, ensuring that these are not touching each other or anywhere else on the former that could dead short it. You can see on this side, it's very easy just to go in series solder those together. However, on this side, one has to cross the other. So to make sure that these don't touch, I'm going to have to run glue under this to secure this one down, put this one on top of the glue, and add more glue back. So all of this will be secure, but these two will not touch where they cross. Now because the gap is so incredibly tight, this is the tightest gap I've ever dealt with. Because it's so tight, I want to make sure that this cone is absolutely perfect in position, in the center, everything lined up exactly how it needs to be because we don't have any margin of error. This is 0.1 millimeters thick, so that's what we're dealing with. So I'm securing the surround to the basket with these clamps while I glue it down to ensure that the cone is not being warped in any kind of way and everything is exactly where it needs to be and stays there until this glue dries. So we'll get some glue down in the gap so that will be secure, and then we can do the extra layer on top of the initial layer for the leads here. And then we can go to the other side of it. Now the joint itself is actually glued, I'm going to put this little piece of paper in between the two leads to ensure we have definitely no case that's going to touch or somehow just barely be touching through the glue or anything like that. So we're going to use this to isolate it, and then we'll get glue on the top joint. With the top joint secure, now we can do down here, because I'm still building this like every other sub we build to take power. Whether it's going to need it or not, we're still going to make sure we got plenty of glue down here and on the back side of the spider. Now with plenty of glue on the triple joint and on the back side, we can get this assembly in here. So we still have the shim in. The only thing we've got to do when we go to glue this in is put a bead on the bottom, make sure these leads are lined up with the terminals, and I will go back and do the surround after these are soldered on. So I've got the spider glued down and we've got our leads poked through the holes here. This will be very easy to solder on. Everything's lined up up here, so we can solder this on. Just like that, our leads are soldered on. So now the only thing we have left is to glue the surround to the basket before we can get to the dust cap. You can put glue down on the basket at the same time as you're doing the spiders. However, I don't like doing that, as sometimes it can create a mess while you get everything in place, that kind of thing. And I'm trying not make a mess of the sub or my hands, which you could wear gloves. But that is one reason why you would not do that on top to begin with, and it's not that bad to go back behind it. And we want to make sure that this is going to be secured. So we're going to go back and use our clamps to make sure we've got a very tight bond. Surround is now dry, and I went ahead and put the gasket on because that's going to make it just a little bit easier to line up the dust cap accordingly. We've got the points for mounting that are very clearly to see, as opposed to just kind of holes drilled and then the lines on the surround there. So we want to remove the shim, and we need to put a glue bead around this ridge. And one reason that I use this cone is because it has the ridge where everything will be perfectly centered. It also makes it very easy to put this glue on. Now with the bead of glue in place, we will make sure that everything is lined up correctly. We're going to put the terminal at the bottom, and we want to have the Fat Boy logo straight across here. So we can't set this crooked because it's very hard to move after the fact. So now we've got this lined up. I'm going to push on the edge. Now normally I would put weight on this dust cap, but I'm not going to, because one, the shape of it, when you put weight on it, it could pull the edges up, but also this is paper, so it is very, very thin, very, very flexible, and I think in doing so it could get a crease with enough weight, or it could also be just that much easier to fold in the other way. So We're going to make sure that everything is pressed in here very well. The glue that I'm using, the E6000, will actually pull it tight a little bit, and we're going paper to paper on the adhesion. So we will give this about an hour to an hour and a half to make sure that this is dry, and then we will have a complete playing sub that we can test. And now the moment that you'd complain about if I didn't include it in the video. We've got this on the test bench, and we're going to make sure that it plays and there's no funny noises or anything else. So, without further ado, and there we have it. This 20-year-old Crunch sub has been brought back to life to be used again and live another day. Even with the super tight gap, there aren't any noises. Everything is good there. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe. If you haven't hit the notification bell, hit the notification bell so you get notified every time we upload a new video. You can support us on Patreon, the link's below, as well as find us on Facebook and Instagram, where we post random things that we do that do not make it to YouTube videos. If you got suggestions for future videos, put those in the comments below. This concludes the Crunch Fat Boy, and I'll see you again in another Tech Stuff Tuesday.